Our opening thought this morning comes from a writing by one of my favorites. You already know who she is, Catherine Hayhoe, who lives down the road in Plano. She writes in her book, Saving Us, these words: rational hope accepts that success is not inevitable or even entirely probable. It takes courage to do that, but when we are doubtful, when the odds are low and success is possible rather than probable, it's that courage and hope that carry us forward. Real hope also provides a vision of a future that we want to live in, where energy is abundant and available to all, where the economy is stable, where we have the resources that we need, where our lives are not worse but better than they are today. It's a hope that is aware of all the others who are already working to make that future happen, and a hope that understands why we're doing this. Our next reading comes from Grace Lee Boggs, who was one of the founding members of the Boggs Center in Detroit, Michigan, a center that's done quite a bit of community organizing within Detroit, including the organizing that's helped lead to the efforts to build urban farming as a key part of the reinvigoration and regeneration of Detroit over the last number of decades. This reading is from an essay she wrote titled "The Beloved Community of Martin Luther King." Boggs writes, in his major writings and speeches in the last 2 years of his life, Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos, and Time to Break Silence, King began to project a new kind of radical revolution that would begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. He rejected the dictatorship of technology, which he said diminishes people because it eliminates their sense of participation. Enlarged material powers, he warned repeatedly, spell enlarged peril if there is no proportionate growth of the spirit, of the soul. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, he said, in 1967, by the way, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Instead, King had a vision of people at the grassroots and community level participating in creating new values, truths, relationships, and infrastructures as the foundation for a new society. He called for programs that would involve young people in self-transforming and structure-transforming direct actions in our dying cities. He called for a radical revolution in values and a new social system that goes beyond both capitalism, which he said is too I-centered, too individualistic, and beyond communism, which is too collective, too statist. Our next reading is from Kimberly Nicholas, from her work, Under the Sky We Make. Kimberly Nicholas is from California, not too far from the Bay Area, but now she is a professor of environmental studies in Sweden. She writes these words: we need a new mindset to have a good future for life on Earth. We can and must change the story of exploitation by identifying all the ways this mindset is baked into our current society, eradicating it and replacing it with a better one. My suggestion for a better story is what I call the regeneration mindset, which is focused on working with rather than against nature and bringing out the best of ourselves and of one another. I've boiled down the regeneration mindset to 3 ideas that could be embroidered on your grandma's throw pillow or pasted in construction paper on your kindergartner's classroom wall. Respect life. Stop harming life. Strengthen life. Sounds pretty basic, but as I hope to illustrate, I think these principles are flexible enough to guide action across diverse circumstances. Actually putting them into practice would be profoundly transformative. As many of you know, the last 8 times that I've been with you, I've been reflecting on the 8 principles of Unitarian Universalism that this congregation has adopted, and 7 of which all of Unitarian Universalism has adopted, and many have adopted the 8th principle as well. And I know the next time that the UUs come together for, is it General Assembly, is that what you call it? That you're going to be looking at your principles again and looking at expressing them perhaps in some different ways and focusing on the shared values that are present within Unitarian Universalism. And as I made my way from reflecting on those 8 principles to deciding what it was that I would talk about today, the last 8 times were really easy for me to figure out what to talk about because I had those 8 principles to look at. I found myself gravitating to the topic of beloved community in the midst of chaos, which is not disconnected from the reflections that I had on those 8 principles, and also not disconnected from reflections that I've had on the social principles within my own denomination, the United Methodist Church. And we're having our general conference in just a few days from now, April 23rd through May 3rd in Charlotte, North Carolina, where thousands of us will descend upon Charlotte, and about 1,000 of those persons will be elected delegates within the General Conference, and they'll be voting on a number of things that will have a profound effect on the life of the United Methodist Church for at least the next 4 years, and probably for many years beyond that. Many of you may know that there has been quite a bit of chaos within the United Methodist Church for many decades. And we've been extremely divided on many things, but especially on being inclusive of persons who are LGBTQ2S+ within the full life and ministry of the United Methodist Church. And there will be quite a bit to be said and done in relation to that over the next few weeks as well. Also connected to the social principles of the United Methodist Church and my reflections on the principles of Unitarian Universalism, some of you know that I was involved in the revision process of the social principles of the United Methodist Church. I was the writing team convener for one of the sections of the social principles. It was called the Natural World section. And one of the first things that the writing team that I was a part of decided is that we would change the name from the natural world to the community of all creation, because all the other sections in the social principles talked about community. Talked about social community, nurturing community, political community, economic community. So every time the social principles of the United Methodist Church talked about community, it was talking about human persons. But when we got to the natural world section, we didn't use the language of community, we simply used the language of natural world. So we thought it was important to change that to the language of community, to move away from this understanding of nature as simply an object simply a commodity to be bought and sold, but rather a community of which we are all members, of which we are all a part. So part of what's going to happen at the General Conference of the United Methodist Church in a few days is we're going to be bringing those revised social principles, which we've been working on since 2012, which should have been passed in 2020, but because of COVID, we're now working to pass them in 2024. And so as I think about beloved community in the midst of chaos, all of that is bubbling up within my own being and my own life as I hope that we will move more towards beloved community in the work that's to come in the next few weeks and less towards more chaos and division. You know, it's in times of chaos, it's when times are chaotic like they've been in my denomination, and also I think really in the world as a whole, and especially here in our society. It's when times are chaotic that we need commitment to building beloved community the most. The purveyors of chaos in our world count on the forces of beloved community in the world to be weak, to lack persistence. But we know that love and justice do have power, often more power than persons recognize, power to be resilient, power to be regenerative. But one of the greatest moral challenges of our time, one of the real challenges of our time, is in the midst of this chaos, in the midst of the divisions that we have, sometimes they feel greater than they've ever been within our society. The challenge that we have is to remain kind and compassionate with one another in the midst of this chaos that we as humanity have created. That's not easy. That is a great but urgent challenge. How do we unravel the blanket of systemic chaos by which we are covered while simultaneously creating a quilt of beloved community? How do we resist those systems and the persons who are perpetuating those systems while still being kind, loving, and compassionate in our work for justice? Oftentimes, and I know that you can see this on social media, maybe not as much as you saw it on social media a few years ago, because I think what's happened is now most people have just blocked each other and aren't talking to each other on social media. But when persons or groups of persons use depersonalizing or dehumanizing language or rhetoric about others, sometimes perhaps we feel right or justified in responding in like manner to them. Yeah, this is kind of natural, right? When you're called a name, it's a natural response to want to call the person who called you a name another name, right? I remember doing that on the playground, unfortunately, growing up. I think perhaps some of you may have had that experience as well. It'd be nice if those ways of being towards each other were left on the playground, but we see them in our everyday life today. And so sometimes we do respond in like manner, but we have to ask ourselves, what are we accomplishing when we do this? Are we not perhaps perpetuating the dehumanizing spiral towards chaos and away from beloved community when we simply respond in like manner to the name calling, to the dehumanizing and depersonalizing language and rhetoric that we hear? I think we must resist that temptation to fight the propaganda of depersonalization with even more depersonalizing propaganda. You've seen it. You've heard it. There are times when anger is both an appropriate and a necessary response to the systemic injustices that we face in the world. It's good and right to be angry about the quadruple evils of racism, poverty, militarism, and ecological degradation that we experience in the world. But it's possible to be angry about these systemic injustices without losing our love and compassion for persons. It's not easy, but it's possible. It's also possible to be angry with individual persons and with groups of persons without demonizing them, without dehumanizing them. In fact, it's vital that we do so. If you look at the history of humanity, almost every time we start using dehumanizing, depersonalizing language in relation to each other, almost every time we do that, it's followed by actions that dehumanize, actions that harm, actions that become deadly. Creating beloved community is nearly impossible if we allow ourselves to become so polarized that we fail to treat each other as persons, when we fail to see each other as human beings. Also, beloved community is nearly impossible if we allow ourselves to become so polarized that we fail to be critical about our own perspectives. I've seen this more and more lately, and it's more and more concerning to me, that there is a kind of squashing of dissent, a squashing of dissent by this argument that it might help the cause of those who we perceive as being on the other side. Don't be critical of our side. That might help the other side. You hear that all the time. And one might understand the pragmatic concerns that are behind that argument, right? But if we do not criticize what we consider to be our own side, our own perspective, because we're simply afraid that it's going to help the other side, that is a sign of a deeply flawed democracy, a deeply flawed community, a deeply flawed society. If we have a political system where dissent within one's own political party results only in the furthering of the agenda of the opposing party, then that is a problem with our political system. And it's a problem with our political system because our political system is set up to perpetuate the hegemony, the control, the power of a two-party duopoly. A two-party duopoly. I've lost track of how many times I've been told not to be publicly critical of the candidate from my own political party, owing to the fear that any public dissent will benefit the opposing party. I hear it all the time. Anytime I make a criticism of someone from my political party that I'm a member of, I hear this argument that I'm helping the other party by expressing that dissent, that criticism publicly. Can we all take a step back and see how deeply unhealthy for democracy this is? Even if we understand the logic behind that argument, if we just take a step back and think about how deeply unhealthy for democracy it is for people to feel like, average, ordinary people to feel like they cannot speak out, they cannot be critical of their own perspectives and the persons who are representing them in their political party because they feel like it's going to help the other side if they do so. If our political systems perpetuate a political culture in which criticisms of one's own political party are portrayed as simply being political betrayal, then we are in need of what Martin Luther King called, and what Grace Lee Boggs was pointing to, we are in need of a revolution of values. We are in need of a revolution of values within our political system, and ultimately we need a new system that is more supportive of a truly participatory democracy, a system that is supportive of criticizing, a system that's supportive of appropriate dissent. Because as we continue to silence dissent in the name of party loyalty or for the sake of protecting democracy itself, you know that those with money and power are not silencing themselves. Nope, they are not. They are continuing to speak openly through their money and their power. It might be behind the scenes, but they are still speaking openly. They are still furthering their agenda, thus furthering the marginalization of persons whose only way to be heard is through the public expression of their concerns, through their own voices. And that is not the path towards beloved community. If we continue to marginalize regular persons, tell them they have to be quiet, tell them they can't dissent, for the sake of protecting democracy, that is not the path to beloved community. Unless we create a system in which people can speak their concerns freely, organize freely to advocate for their concerns, and vote freely for the persons who represent their concerns, then we will continue to see increased division and polarization within our communities. This is the path of chaos we currently find ourselves on. The path of chaos on which we see each other as libtards and maggots rather than as persons seeking beloved community together. You've heard those words. You've heard the two sides call each other those horrific words. Every time in history, we use dehumanizing, depersonalizing language of other persons. It's followed by dehumanizing actions as well. The good news is that there are systems. We know there are because they're out there, they work. There are systems that can make our democracy more just and more participatory. One such system I've shared with you before, one of my favorite systems to promote and advocate for, is ranked choice voting. You've heard me talk about ranked choice voting before, sometimes just called RCV. Sometimes it's also called instant runoff voting. And all that ranked choice voting allows for us to do is rank our preferences of the candidates. So, and that way, if you rank your preferences, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. There might be more than 3, so you can rank more than 3. You can always vote for your first choice every time without worrying that voting for your first choice is going to hurt your second choice candidate, and perhaps even more importantly, without worrying that voting for your first choice candidate is going to help the candidate that you like the least on the ballot. If your first choice candidate doesn't get enough votes in the first round, then in the instant runoff, your votes will go to your second choice. The next round, if your second choice candidate doesn't get enough votes to get to the next round of instant runoff, then it goes to your third choice. Imagine going to the polls and being able to say to yourself, I can vote for the person I really like without worrying about being a spoiler, without worrying about it, helping someone I really don't want to win. That's just one system. That's just one potential reform that might be part of a revolution of values that could help us have a more participatory democracy. But the persons, groups, and entities with wealth and power in our society who are benefiting from the chaos and division of our current system are doing everything in their power to block ranked choice voting, to block instant runoff voting. They're also doing everything in their power to block other reforms for a more participatory democracy. State legislature after state legislature, including attempts in my home state, across the river in Oklahoma, are attempting to ban ranked choice voting, to make it not possible for the state of Oklahoma or any municipalities in the whole state to vote for and implement ranked choice voting. Because they know that it will change the chaos and division and the system that is currently helping them stay in power. As I said, RCV is just one reform among many to help achieve a revolution of values that's needed to move us away from chaos, perhaps and inch us a little bit towards beloved community. Just one way, but it's up to all of us. It's up to all of us to find many other ways to be creative, to talk with each other, to criticize ideas, to openly be in discussion, and sometimes be in dissent. It's up to all of us to find many other ways that will heal our divisions, that will help lead us to a more just, beloved, and participatory community. I hope that we will continue to do that work together, even in the midst of chaos. Our closing thought comes from Quint Studer, who says, we have to help create a safety net inside our community. Think of this like an old-fashioned barn raising. We need to come together to provide help where and when it is needed. It's up to us to create safety nets inside our communities.